So today marks, as I said before, the second Sunday of the Advent season in the Christian calendar. And as I mentioned last week, Unitarian Universalists didn't really observe this season for many years, for a long time. But increasingly over the past few years, a growing number of congregations, I'd say the past 15 or so years, have begun to reimagine it. Not only as a Christian observance, but as a universal time of anticipation, awaiting not only the return of the light as our ancestors did before winter, during the winter solstice, but in expectation of a better world that we actively work to build. Remember, I said last week that Advent is not passive, it's active. While we wait, we still work. We still do something. So we're leaning in a little this year and thinking again, or perhaps some of us for the first time, maybe, thinking about this person, Jesus of Nazareth, who Advent in the Christian tradition anticipates. Now, the reality is we don't know much about it, other than the accounts given in the first 4 books of the Christian Gospels, right? The scriptures, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in fact, other than 2 passing mentions of him by the Jewish historian Josephus in his book, Antiquities of the Jews, there are no other historical mentions of Jesus until many years after his death. And even the one mentioned by Josephus is called into question by scholars. And most scholars consider it probably be to a later Christian addition to that book to make it look good. So we really don't know much about him. Most of what we know, we think we know about Jesus today comes not from the historical record of his day and age, but from oral reports, right? All of those Gospels were oral traditions passed down for years, and the stories and the legends and the traditions that were handed down through the ages. In fact, we know more about the life of Gautama Buddha, who lived 600 years before Christ, than we do about Jesus, because Gautama Buddha came from a wealthy, probably a kingly family. His father was probably a king. We're not absolutely certain of that. That's the tradition. But they were at least a wealthy family, and wealthy families kept records. But the family of a poor Jewish carpenter would not have been keeping a record, especially a Jewish carpenter under Roman occupation. They didn't keep records like that. And maybe you're asking if you know the gospel stories, especially the one in Luke, where it says that Joseph and Mary left Nazareth to go to Bethlehem. Remember, they had to travel because Caesar had proclaimed that he was taking a census of all the people in the Roman Empire. And so that's why they went from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And maybe we have a record there. The actual truth is we don't even have a record of that census. It was never taken. It's just a story. There's no record of it. The Christian scriptures also don't give any physical description of Jesus. We don't know what he looked like. Some Christians believe that this passage in Isaiah 53 that we hear a lot at this time of year in the Jewish scriptures refers to him. It says, he grew up like a tender root and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised and was held in low esteem. Or one more modern version, the Message, puts it this way. It says, this servant grew up a scrawny seedling, a scrubby plant in a parched field. There was nothing attractive about him, nothing to cause us to take a second look. He was looked down on and passed over, a man who suffered, who knew pain firsthand. One look at him and people turned away. They looked down on him, and they thought he was scum. Now, even if that's true, that's not really a description of him. That's how the church has traditionally interpreted those verses, and applied them to Jesus. But down through the centuries, people have tried to depict him in paintings, right? And in icons, in stained glass, and in other medium. And this time of year, we see him everywhere, right? In the nativity scenes, the creches that we see on church lawns, maybe on our neighbor's lawn. Maybe some of you still set up a nativity scene in your home. We even see them on public property in some places. And there's been lots of trouble about that over the years. But it's really, those nativity scenes are really a model, a tableau of the nativity scene. And it comes from the word crèche comes from the old French word, simply meaning a stall, a manger or a stall. But during the first 13 centuries after Jesus, no one thought of setting any of those things up. There were no creches to celebrate Christmas. Christmas was really a minor holiday. The preeminent Christian tradition then was Easter, not Christmas. The first crèche, the first nativity scene, is attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, who in 1223, he put some hay in a manger, a feeding trough, and he got a live donkey and a live cow, and he put them with the hay in a cave. And then he went to the cave and he gathered all the villagers, and he gave a sermon about the birth of Jesus. That was the first nativity scene, and people caught on. It caught on to people after that. And eventually, in those live nativity scenes, they added people. So some people, a woman would play the role of Mary, and then someone would play Joseph. There might have been wise men and shepherds in the scene. There was a little baby in the manger, right, in the hay. It was really a form of the miracle plays that were performed during the Middle Ages. And the people, mostly in Europe then, began making models of them to put in their own homes, right? And they took on a regional look to them. So, for example, the ones in Italy, where St. Francis had done that, in Greccio, Italy, the ones in Italy were generally seen as being done in a cave, because that's where St. Francis first did it. And then in Northern European countries like Germany and the Scandinavian countries, they decided that they would put them in a stall, because that's what they were more familiar with, in a manger scene. My family had one of those for many years. I don't know if your family did, if you grew up with one of those. My family had one. It was pretty big, I recall. And they had gotten that back in the 40s, before I was born, when they lived in Massachusetts. And whenever they moved, it went with them. And I remember setting it up every year, and it was made of wood, and it had the little fake moss on top, you know, and it had the figures who were made of plaster of Paris, that if you dropped them, they would break or damage, and you'd try to glue them back together, but they never did work quite well. And I remember the best thing I liked about them was that the cow, actually there were two cows. The cows, for some reason, the company that made them made the horns of the cows out of these tiny little, very tightly wound springs. They weren't plaster of Paris, they were springs. You could do this to them and go boing, you know, and I used to have fun doing that. And then I also had fun pulling them. And after a while, over the years, the cows' horns were like, you know, and they weren't really horns anymore. They were just pieces of wire hanging down. But my parents never got rid of them. And they had them they had that for many, many years. It began to look kind of shabby over years, but it was still there every Advent season. And these days you can find all sorts of nativity scenes, right? You go online or you go to the store and you still see them. And they're very creative these days. Some of them have not just the animals, the shepherds and the cows and the sheep and all that stuff. Some of them might have penguins, which is fine with me because I love penguins. They might be made of Lego. Maybe they might have Disney characters as the main characters. They're very, very creative, right? But the traditional crèche that I grew up with always had Mary kneeling adoringly at the manger, Joseph standing behind her, leaning on his staff, because allegedly he was so much older than her. And he was always looking very fatherly in those things. And then the sheep, the cow, the donkey, an angel or two, the shepherds and the wise men with their gifts. And of course, the baby Jesus lying on the hay with his arms spread wide, as if to say, here I am, you know. So what does this have to do with Advent? Well, there was something peculiar, I think, and still is, about those nativity scenes, at least the majority of them. Everybody in them, at least the one we had, and the ones I was familiar with growing up, and the ones we still mostly see, everybody in them was white, except perhaps for one of the wise men, who tradition says was Balthazar, and who gave the baby Jesus the gift of myrrh, which is a type of, well, it was used as medicine. It was also used for embalming. Great gift for a kid, right? That's why he should have given him a gift card. It would have worked so much better. Nobody would have gotten him myrrh. Anyway, that's the only person in those scenes who was Black, was one wise man. Just as the season of Lent, though, is about the contemplation of the death and resurrection of Jesus prior to Easter, Advent is about the contemplation of the birth of Jesus. And both of them focus on the physical body of Jesus, the embodiment. In the faith tradition I was brought up in, Christmas was the more powerful image rather than the Lenten image, because in my church, actually in the tradition I grew up in, the Salvation Army, there wasn't even a cross on the altar. But in most Protestant traditions, evangelical traditions, there's a cross, but not a crucifix. There's no body of Jesus on the cross. And so for me, Christmas was the more powerful image, since the imagery at Easter was a bare cross and not that suffering Jesus, but of a baby being born. And in the Christian tradition, Advent is about contemplating the idea of incarnation at Christmas, the idea that's expressed in the carol that we sang earlier, O come, Emmanuel, which means God with us. It's a Hebrew name. And it comes from chapter 7 and verse 14 in the book of the prophet Isaiah in the Hebrew scriptures, where it says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and you will call him Emmanuel. Now that verse is also quoted in the first chapter of Matthew, where he relates the birth of Jesus. And he quotes that in order to support the idea that Jesus was the Messiah. And I won't get into a discussion here about the idea of the virgin birth, except to say that the vast majority of scholars agree that the word translated from the Hebrew texts, especially into the King James Version, where it really all began, and later translations, that word virgin is a mistranslation, that it really just means a young woman. What the story is about, though, is about incarnation, the idea of God, the divine, however you may think of that, manifesting itself in human form, in a human body. The Gospel of John, in the first chapter, says that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. That word in Greek is logos. Logos means word, and it's a Greek used there. It's a Greek philosophical term, not only used in Christian scriptures, it was used throughout Greek philosophy. And it really talks about the unifying creative force of the universe. What I always, I always refer to it as that in which we move and live and have our being. And that took on human form, according to the book of John and according to the Christian tradition at Christmas time. Now, in our liberal tradition, most of us believe that Jesus was just a man. Perhaps he was a great teacher. I believe he was a great teacher. I believe he was a radical prophet who spoke out against injustice and who preached a message of love and inclusion, and who was an example of the divine that lives in each of us. So as I have said each year at this time, although we don't believe this story to be historically or literally true, we can still glean spiritual truth from it if we, at least for a brief time during this season, suspend our disbelief and listen to the story behind the story, delve into the mythos, the myth of the story. In that very familiar poem, For So the Children Come by Sophia Lyon-Foss, which we'll read again on Christmas Eve, we read the words, "Each night a child is born is a holy night," meaning that each of us hold that spark of divinity within us. And so even as we understand Jesus in this light, we can appreciate the idea that this idea of incarnation, of an embodied divinity, is a powerful one, right? It's a very powerful image, and it evokes very powerful and moving feelings when we think about it deeply enough. And the images of Jesus down through the ages that we're familiar with, and which most of us grew up with, also evoke some ideas about the concept of incarnation, of God, and of divinity with us. And if that's so, then we need to think about the images of white Jesus, because incarnation is a very powerful and intimate spiritual idea. God, or divinity, as one of us, Emmanuel, God with us. Or as Joan Osborne sang in her song from the 80s, what if God was one of us, just a slob like one of us? So naturally, various cultures and peoples want to understand that by imagining a Jesus that looks like them, and increasingly artists around the world are doing that. We've all seen the images, both at Christmas time and at Easter time, right? Some people would ask then, if that's the case, if it's like the song James Taylor sang, some children see him lily white, some children see him bronzed and brown, some children see him with almond eyes. That song, by the way, was written in the 1940s. And I think for the 1940s, it was a pretty forward song. Oddly enough, when it was printed in printed form, all of those children of different colors were gathered around the manger, and Jesus was white. Think about that. But some people would ask, well, Paul, if all these people are seeing Jesus in their own way anyway, what's the problem with seeing a white baby Jesus for Americans of European descent? What's the big deal? Given the history of white supremacy, particularly in the West, and in the United States particularly, especially, there's a particular danger in perceiving Jesus, the alleged incarnation of the divine, as white, because incarnation transcends skin color and racial divisions. Seeing only a white Jesus has real consequences. In all likelihood, if you close your eyes, right, and picture Jesus, you'll unintentionally imagine a white man. Most of us would. I grew up thinking that. When I first thought of Jesus as not white, it was kind of difficult. It was a shock to me to think that. And even though I intellectually knew that Jesus was not white, it was difficult. But an exclusively white Jesus not only narrows our understanding of him, it sends a message that connects Jesus to the powerful, to those people who wield the power, to the oppressor and not the oppressed, to the powerful and not the powerless. The professor and the author Anthea Butler writes, every time you see white Jesus, you see white supremacy. If Jesus is white and God is white, then authority is white. Remember a couple of years ago, there was the big to-do, a brouhaha that they stirred up on Fox News because there was a mall Santa Claus who was hired, and he was a black man. And they made an issue out of it. And they kept saying that Santa was white, just like Jesus was white. And the majority of white Christians are caught up in that inaccurate narrative and of turning it into a weapon of racism and domination and exclusion and colonialism. I mean, just a brief survey of the history of missionary work throughout the church history, particularly as it began in earnest in the 1700s and in the 18th and 19th centuries. Missionary work, which is really just spiritual colonialism, right? Acting as a precursor to literal colonialism. That'll prove that. Just look at the history of missionary work, what happens there. The image of white Jesus affirms for white people that whiteness is equivalent to God. And it teaches everyone else that they should submit to whiteness as if it were divine. White images of Jesus have been used repeatedly to subject non-white populations to the system of white supremacy. Just look at the indigenous peoples. And the theological idea in many religions of color, of the color white rather, in religions that think about the color white, a lot of them believe that it's equated with goodness, right? White is good and light, but black is dark and evil sometimes. That's not just Christianity. That's a good number of religious traditions have that idea. I have to be clear that I don't believe that all of Christianity is inherently white supremacist. But Christian faith in America and Europe particularly has been interpreted in a way that upholds the tenets of white supremacy. And that's built on the 18th and 19th century Western values and those cultural values that were intertwined into mainline American Christianity. And they protect and uphold white supremacy. That's why today we see so many evangelicals nervous about the fact that within a few years, white people will not be the majority in this country any longer. And that scares them. I could say it scares the bejesus out of them. As a Jew, well, let me go back. Against the backdrop of US history, right? If you go back and read history of European Christians colonizing and indigenous lands with the blessing of the doctrine of discovery, if you remember that from your history classes, and enslaving African people, the universal image of Jesus as white is not simply problematic, it perpetuates the evil of racism. As a Jew, Jesus was an ethnic minority in the Roman Empire. He was a Middle Eastern Jew. We're not sure exactly what hue his skin was, what color his skin was, but we know it wasn't white. It may have been dark, it may have been bronze, it may have, we don't know, but we know it wasn't white. And Jews were marginalized by Romans and Greeks and other non-Jewish groups in a lot of those imperial cities that they had and empires. As an infant, according to the story, Jesus was a target of ruler-sanctioned infanticide. If you remember, it says that Herod sent out his soldiers to kill all the young male babies under 2 years old. And so he and his family fled to Egypt as refugees. And throughout his life, he knew what it was like to be a member of an ethnic group whose culture and religion and the experiences they had on a daily basis were marginalized by those in power. We see the stories on the news constantly of marginalized people in this country, particularly our Black sisters and brothers, being abused by the state, being beaten by them in the streets, being executed wrongly by the state. The Jews of Jesus' time in the Roman Empire went through similar things on a daily basis. So Jesus knew what that was like. The author Jamar Tisby writes this. He says, believing in a white Jesus denigrates the image of God in Black people and other people of color. To say that Jesus is Black, or more broadly, to say that Jesus is not white, is to say that Jesus identifies with the oppressed, and that the experience of marginalized people is not foreign to God, but that God is on the side of those who in Matthew 25, Jesus refers to as the least of these. When Jesus spoke to people, he spoke to people who were on the outskirts of polite society, because he himself was on the outskirts. He ministered to them because he was one of them. He experienced poverty. He experienced exploitation by the state, particularly through the taxation system. And then he experienced state-sanctioned violence, including the death penalty. So this year at Advent, perhaps we can all reflect on the importance of a more expansive and inclusive understanding of the idea of incarnation. And when we see those white little baby Jesuses and the white holy families in the manger scenes, we can think, that's not the way it was. That's not the way it has to be. That's not what incarnation is about. One of the earliest debates in the history of Christianity was about the nature of Jesus. Was he born fully God? Was he born fully human? Was he a combination of both? The early church father, Gregory, he said something along the lines of, if he wasn't fully human, then he couldn't fulfill his mission of healing, because he never would have understood what it means to be in pain. As people of a liberal religious tradition, we are called to see all of humanity as the embodiment of the divine. Symbols have meaning. The creche is a symbol. The manger scene is a symbol. And symbols matter. And in this season of Advent, we should be able to see in it the images of a tender body lying in a manger, no matter what color. Jean Valjean, in Les Miserables, he says, to love another person is to see the face of God, no matter what color. May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.